Without further ado, let's get on to the evolution of plate tectonics. All right, the biggest controversy in Earth's tectonic history. When did plate tectonics start? So, trying to get rid of the thing there. Many geoscientists think that plate tectonics began in the Archean. That's more than 2.5 billion years ago. I think that the present episode of plate tectonics began much more recently. So these are this sort of nice wheel showing geologic time back to the beginning of the Earth shows when different people have said they think plate tectonics started. And you can see most people are like, oh, it started a long time ago. And then these guys, Warren Hamilton was a very famous tectonicist, passed away recently. So it's kind of just me, but we're arguing that plate tectonics began much more recently. So obviously, I'm going to give you my side of the story. I hope that it's to a certain extent balanced, but this is buyer beware kind of stuff. So let's just remind, this is the fourfold division of Earth history. So we're going to discuss Earth's tectonic history. And so the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic, those are the time periods that we'll be talking about. And within the Proterozoic, there are three subdivisions from oldest to youngest: the Paleoproterozoic, the Mesoproterozoic, and the Neoproterozoic. Let's watch the video.
Around 2 billion years ago, Earth was a very different place. Pretty much everything was more extreme than it is today, from ocean chemistry to slimy life on land to the position of land masses. Things were generally a little weird. The oceans would have been inhospitable to most animal life today because they were very low in oxygen but really high in sulfur. Meanwhile, on land, there wasn't much life to speak of, except for microbial organisms like cyanobacteria and possibly lichens. Even the temperature inside the Earth was more extreme than it is today. But the world for these early living things was also kind of boring. The climate was remarkably stable, there wasn't much glacial activity, and the sun was 5 to 18% less powerful than it is today. Even the rocks under the microbes were fairly stable. Modern plate tectonics, which is the movement of rock plates on top of Earth's mantle, hadn't gotten started yet. The mantle was just too hot, so it bound the continental plates together into a supercontinent, and the plates were flimsy and thin. Because this time in Earth's history was so stable, geologists once called it the boring billion, the billion years from about 1.8 billion to 800 million years ago. But the fact is, this period was anything but boring. In fact, it set the stage for our modern version of plate tectonics and probably for the rise of life as we know it. Today, Earth's plate tectonic cycle is active. The plates move around, forming mountains as they smash together, shallow seas when they rift apart, and even volcanoes when they slide under each other. Plate movement is responsible for some of Earth's most noticeable features, including the Himalayas, the East African Rift Valley, and the Pacific Ring of Fire. They're so important that it's almost hard to imagine what the planet looked like before plate tectonics. To figure that out, we have to go back to when Earth was first settling down from its formation, back to the end of the Archean eon almost 3 billion years ago. Unfortunately for geologists, a lot of the rock record has been continuously recycled and destroyed through subduction, where one slab of rock slides under another and dives down into the mantle where it melts. That means evidence of the oldest rocks is really limited because they've been ripped apart, smashed together, and eroded away. But the Archean rocks that did manage to survive on Earth's surface are spread out all over the world in places like North America, Australia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, and some are more than 3 billion years old. And that presented a puzzle to geologists who wanted to find out when modern plate tectonics started and what it looked like. Since subduction is one of the main drivers behind today's plate tectonics, they looked for evidence of subduction as a sign of the beginning of ancient plate tectonics. So scientists slowly pieced together evidence from the few surviving rock slabs as well as computer models to start to understand the Archean. You see, geologists can look at minerals in a rock to figure out how deep a piece of land went into the Earth's interior and how hot it got. And they found that starting around 2.78 billion years ago in the late Archean, there is solid evidence that the lithosphere was busy. There were supercontinents breaking apart and forming, mountain-building episodes, and metamorphism, where rocks are transformed by high heat and pressure. Now, that certainly sounds a lot like plate tectonics, but does it really count as the first example of plate tectonics? Well, geologists have opinions about that. It didn't work the same way as the modern version of plate tectonics because Earth's mantle was hotter than it is today, about 250 degrees Celsius hotter. The mantle reached peak temperatures in the Archean and has been slowly cooling since then. So 2.8 billion years ago, the mantle was still holding on to more heat than it is today. Those high mantle temperatures made the crust thin, weak, and easy to deform, like cookies straight out of the oven. The metamorphic rock record shows that if there was subduction into the mantle, the sinking crust stayed pretty shallow, unlike today. It was a different flavor of subduction. That's why some geologists don't think this really counts as the first evidence of plate tectonics. But these early movements of the lithosphere helped separate the crust into plates. Those plates crammed together in one spot, leading to the formation of the supercontinent Nuna by 1.8 billion years ago. Welcome to the so-called boring billion. Remember, all of this was over a billion years before the Cambrian explosion, so with the exception of some microbes, there was no life on land. It was confined to the ocean. And the ocean was very different than it is now. 2 billion years ago, it was likely that most of the ocean was very low in oxygen. But what it did have in abundance was hydrogen sulfide, and by 1.6 billion years ago, that combination created a condition known as euxinia, which is toxic to most eukaryotes, organisms that have an enclosed nucleus in each cell. But the prokaryotes, simpler life forms that don't have an enclosed nucleus, made the best of their strange environment. Microscopic life forms like archaea were perfectly happy, and so were bacteria like cyanobacteria, which were photosynthetic and could metabolize the abundant sulfur in the ocean. Also, there were purple and green sulfur bacteria, which are brightly colored photosynthetic microbes that can form squishy mats in aquatic environments. They sound like they belong in a sci-fi movie, but they're very real and still around today. So most of the life found in the boring billion was prokaryotic, and with all this sulfur in the environment, researchers think this period was the stinkiest time on Earth. But to geobiologists, scientists who study the interactions between the biosphere and Earth's physical processes, this period was never boring because it marked the beginning of complex eukaryotic life. For example, in China, there are rock formations that contain fossils of eukaryotes that date back 1.7 billion to 1.4 billion years ago. The majority of these organisms lived in water, like protists and other early eukaryotes. So life on the early supercontinent with limited plate movement was doing okay, but it was still all microbes and slimy mats trying to survive in sulfur-rich water. So how did we get from there to here, or even to the Cambrian explosion? Well, life needed Earth to shake things up. And that didn't happen in the boring billion, at least not enough to make a huge difference. The old flavor of softer, squishier plate tectonics continued, with minor, shallow subductions around Nuna and the next supercontinent Rodinia. Plates on the outside of the supercontinent were mostly stagnant, but started sinking into the mantle, which was beginning to cool. Then, probably no later than 750 million years ago, during the breakup of Rodinia, the cooler mantle meant that the plates weren't continuously melting and sticking together. Separate slabs of rock could interact, forming rift valleys and subduction zones. Some geologists say this was the beginning of modern plate tectonics because they have clear evidence of deep subduction. For example, they found metamorphic minerals that could only have formed at high pressure deep in Earth's mantle. And that would have been impossible under the earlier type of plate tectonics, when the plates stayed shallower and softer. So experts are still debating whether the earlier period of subduction really counts as the beginning of plate tectonics. And some say there was even older evidence of tectonic movement, as far back as 4 billion years ago. But there's one thing that they all agree on. Plate tectonics helped shape the planet into the habitable world we know today. As supercontinents like Rodinia broke up into separate plates, the slabs jostled each other, smashing together or moving apart. When two plates separate from each other, oceanic ridges form, which are underwater mountain ranges where hot magma constantly comes out and cools, becoming part of the plates. This process is called seafloor spreading. Today, seafloor spreading is occurring in several ocean basins, and oceanic ridges are some of the best places to find hydrothermal activity, where the water interacts with hot, fresh ocean crust. These vents are hotspots for biodiversity, especially because they are so rich in iron and silica, important fertilizers for many life forms. And moving plates can constantly create new habitats and destroy others, which promotes rapid diversification of life. Researchers have shown that biodiversity increases really fast when there's more continental fragmentation. Plus, the arrangement of continents can impact ocean circulation, climate, carbon cycling, and many of the other processes that help shape life on Earth. So it turns out that the boring billion wasn't really boring at all. Earth was just settling down and getting ready for its next big move. And today, we're the only planet known to have this type of plate tectonics. So while the movement of continental plates can be destructive, it might have also been pretty important for pushing life past the squishy microbe stage to create the lush, complex diversity of living things that we know today.
Okay, so that's kind of introduction. There's a lot of things we could argue about in that, but I think overall that's a very useful introduction to what we're going to talk about. So, as she mentioned, to reconstruct Earth's tectonic history, we have to study rocks of different ages. And you'll notice that there's no Hadean crust. And that's because, as she noted, that the farther back you go, the more active recycling things were going on. So that's the definition of the Hadean. It's a time when we do not have any rocks. So let's look at a few sort of foundational concepts, and let's start with the Urey ratio. So the Urey ratio describes the ratio of internal heat production to heat loss. So internal heat production is results from radioactivity inside the Earth. So if you think about it, it's a pretty simple ratio. A body can either cool off or heat up. And we know that very well. If you wear your jacket outside in the summer heat, you're not going to cool off, right? If you want to cool off, you have to reduce that thermal insulating layer, get rid of your coat. So a Urey ratio, U sub R, is, as we said, the ratio of planetary heat production to heat loss. So a Urey ratio that's less than 1 means the planetary interior is cooling off with time. And if it's greater than 1, it means it's heating up with time. So what is Earth's Urey ratio? Well, that's not too hard to figure out. Heat loss around the entire Earth is calculated at 45 terawatts, or 45 times 10 to the 12th watts. So what is the internal heat production or radioactivity? And so there's two ways we estimate that. One is from Earth models based on chondritic meteorites, and the other is from measuring the neutrino flux. And both of these agree that somewhere between 17 and 20 terawatts of internal heat production due to radioactive decay. So Earth's Urey ratio is 20 over 45, which is about 0.44. So Earth is cooling rapidly. Now, the Urey ratio changes with time for two reasons. First of all, heat production, radioactivity, and therefore heat production has been decreasing rapidly through Earth's history. So we can see here the total radioactivity. This is actually heat production in watts per kilogram of material. So the total was 2.5 back at the beginning, and it's like, what is that, 0.6 now? That's just telling you it's decreased by 75% since the Earth began. And the other reason that the Urey ratio will change with time, besides changing decreasing radioactivity is the fact that it depends heavily on the tectonic style. So we talked about these different tectonic styles in the first lecture. So based on the presence or absence of a globally connected mobile mosaic of rigid plates separated by narrow high-strain plate boundaries, that is plate tectonics, we can classify the tectonic behavior of any actively convecting silicate body into plate tectonics, modern Earth, and single lid tectonics, which we haven't talked about much, but we'll spend a fair amount talking about, and that video talked quite a bit about it. So we've got 3 examples of single lid tectonics. All of them are different. Io, Jupiter's moon, is characterized by a heat pipe single lid tectonics. Venus is characterized by a vigorous or squishy lid, single lid tectonics. And Mars is characterized by sort of a sluggish single lid tectonic style. All 4 of these bodies are tectonically active, but they each have a different tectonic style, which means they are each losing heat differently. Now, so tectonic style controls heat loss. So what single lid tectonics does, and by the way, these are Clint's excellent drawings, single lid tectonics insulates the convecting mantle, leading to lower heat loss and a higher Urey ratio, right? If you lose less heat with the same amount of radioactivity, you're going to have a higher Urey ratio. On the other hand, plate tectonics is much more effective for cooling than single lid tectonics. And why is that? Well, there's 2 reasons that plate tectonics is so efficient for cooling. One is we've got cooling at 2 sites. One is the rise of asthenosphere and melting to generate new oceanic crust and lithosphere and mid-ocean ridges is releasing internal heat very effectively. And the other is the sinking of cold oceanic lithosphere into the mantle and subduction zones, is cooling the mantle as well. So the present Urey ratio for Earth of 0.44 may not have always been Earth's Urey ratio. It could have been much higher for both of these reasons. So here is a very simple, but maybe confusing. Yes, Clint.
I just noticed there was a problem in those diagrams, which maybe we didn't catch when we were drawing them, but the convection in the asthenosphere looks like melting, like way down deep.
Yeah, well, yeah, we could probably do that. You're probably right.
Oh well. Job security.
Yeah. So, okay, here we're looking at an interesting graph. So we're looking at the mantle potential temperature, which is a way of characterizing the asthenospheric temperature. So right now, as you know, the top of the asthenosphere is on the order of 1300. What's that? 1350. We argue about what it is exactly, but most scientists that are interested in this problem characterize it as somewhere around 1300, 1350, maybe 1400, no higher. And the other thing we know is that at about 1800 degrees centigrade, the entire Earth would be molten. And that's the magma ocean regime we see over there on the far right, which all of the silicate planets are thought to have had at their beginning. So that would correspond to the Hadean. Maybe it's why we don't have Hadean rocks, is that for much of that time, there were no rocks on the surface. It was all magma. And then we go into the Archean, Paleoproterozoic, Mesoproterozoic, Neoproterozoic, and Phanerozoic, right? Now, if you do a simple calculation of what the temperature would be with a given Urey ratio, what you get is that given the present Urey ratio and the present mantle potential temperature, the Earth would reach 1800 degrees about 1.5 billion years ago. Now that didn't happen, and we know that didn't happen because we have rocks back to 4 billion years. So if the entire Earth had been molten in the Mesoproterozoic, we would have no rocks older than that. Okay, so that right by itself tells us that our present Urey ratio cannot have been extrapolated simply back in time. Something else happened. And this is a confusing point, so don't hesitate to ask questions. Happy to discuss. All right, so we know that simple model is wrong because we know that there's crust, fair amount of crust as old as 4 billion years. All right, so now we can reconstruct Earth's thermal history by looking at the temperature of basalts and we mentioned komatiites, Archean rocks called komatiites, ultra mafic lavas, if you will. And so here we've got 3 independent estimates for the mantle potential temperature through time via the magmatic temperatures of the basalts worked out from looking at their compositions. And the reason that's telling you about the mantle is, when a basalt and the mantle source, it forms from are in equilibrium at the site of magma generation, the temperature of the basalt magma is the same as the temperature of the mantle it came from. So these dots, these error bars, these squares in blue, and this little yellow line yellow field down here from different studies tells us that the way that the Earth cooled was the oldest age we have rocks we can do this for is something like 3.5 billion years, but it's been cooling at a much slower rate than a Urey ratio of 0.3 or even 0.4 would give us. So clearly, the Urey ratio must have been higher in the past in order to allow that evolution. Is that clear? Anybody got any questions about that? All right, so the way I approach it is not to look at when plate tectonics started, but to try and work it back in time. So we know what's going on today. So we probably know what happened yesterday and maybe a year ago and maybe 100, maybe a million, and maybe, working it back in time is, until we get to the point where we're going, I'm not sure what's going on, and then we can leave that for somebody else. So I've done that back through about 2.5 billion years ago. So plate tectonics is Earth's tectonic regime today. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But has it always been? And the answer is almost certainly not. I mean, we've just seen with the Urey ratios, we can see why it must have had a different tectonic regime. So let's sometimes it's a question of definitions. Let's define plate tectonics. So this is Taras Urey and I worked on this. He's a professor at ETH in Zurich, Switzerland, and this is our definition: a global tectonic system powered by subduction in which the lithosphere is divided into a global mosaic of strong plates which move on and sink into weaker ductile asthenosphere. 3 types of localized plate boundaries form the interconnected global network. New oceanic lithosphere is created by seafloor spreading at mid-ocean ridges. Old oceanic lithosphere sinks at subduction zones, and 2 plates slide by each other along transform faults. We spent quite a bit of time in this class talking about these. The negative buoyancy of old dense oceanic lithosphere sinking in subduction zones mostly powers plate movements. And that is somewhat controversial, but if we have a scale of controversy from 0, accepted science, to 10 where that's nonsense, then I would say that the controversy number for that statement is maybe 2. Of course, it's always more complicated than that, but that last sentence is mostly true. All right. Well, which leads to 2 other questions. If Earth had something other than plate tectonics at some time in the past, what other kinds of tectonic regimes could it have had? And can we recognize these in the geologic record? So, if a active silicate planet doesn't have plate tectonics, what is its tectonic style? And we have made this point early on in this class, and I've reiterated that it had to have been some kind of single lid tectonics. Okay, let's define single lid tectonics. Single lid tectonics contrasts with plate tectonics in that there's no global mosaic of moving rigid tectonic plates divided by weak tectonic boundaries. And there is no long-lived subduction that drives horizontal plate motions. There are lots of terms for various kinds of single lid tectonics, including volcanic heat pipe, squishy lid, and stagnant lid. And just so you know, I prefer to reserve the term stagnant lid for convectively dead bodies like Mercury and our moon. All right, so we've seen this before. Here we have sort of an idealized evolution of, I guess, lithosphere in a silicate body from magma ocean to, stagnant lid like the moon or Mercury. And now we have some examples, planetary examples of these. And so you start off with magma ocean. This might be what the early Hadean Earth looked like. And then a crust forms over that, a basaltic crust or a komatiitic crust. And every once in a while, magma from the underlying melt zone, which is probably high degree melt, breaks through and makes a volcano like Io. That might have been like the late Hadean Earth. And then as the mantle lithosphere starts to form, initially it's thin and weak, it's hot, and so you'll have these little drips, and then little places where something like a plume will come out and erupt. And as time goes on, the lithosphere and the planet cools, you'll get a thicker lithosphere, and you get bigger plumes and bigger drips. And it's possible that a diversion to an episode of plate tectonics where you have sideways moving plates because of the strong, dense lithosphere sinking in subduction zones at some point. And then at the end, the entire thing is lithosphere. The entire mantle is lithosphere. There's no convection going on or none that has much of an effect on the surface. And we can call that terminal stagnant lid like we see on the moon or Mercury. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. We're seeing a progression in lithospheric strength from none to incredibly strong, from early and hot to late and cold. And in single lid, from early, intermediate, and late single lid, and with plate tectonics being something of a little bit of a special event.
Well, the logic's compelling, or you can't argue against it, but you're saying that basically the Urey ratio had to be a lot higher, and because plate tectonics is so efficient, it couldn't have been around back then, but could have it been around and just been less efficient? There's less plates, less motion, or something like that, or so it, the heat loss wasn't as great. And I think that's what you're saying in this, but it's not calling it plate tectonics, I guess.
Right. Yeah, this is all very simplified. Yeah, I think even Venus has evidence of having subduction zones, and I think everybody would agree that is a single lid tectonic regime. But those subduction zones don't link up into a global mosaic. And that's the difference.
Okay.
Sometimes people say, well, if you have evidence for subduction, you have evidence of plate tectonics. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, right?
Gotcha.
You got to have something else going on, and I'll try and convince you what some of those things might be. But yeah, this is pretty cutting edge stuff, but it's quite accessible to anybody that's got a fairly good background in tectonics. You know, whereas a lot of stuff in science is like, I have no idea what you're talking about. All right, so before plate tectonics, Earth had some kind of single lead tectonic regime, maybe something like what Venus has today. So, and just to remind you, there's 3 out of the 4 big active silicate bodies have single lid tectonics, and they're all different styles. So Eo's got the heat pipe we talked about. Venus has many drips and plumes and drips, and Mars has a few good plumes and drips. All right, so my 3 papers the last 7 years tell the story. So 2018, the paper on the evolution of plate tectonics, which was basically summarizing my arguments over the years about why modern episode of plate tectonics began 750 or so million years ago. In 2020, a paper that addressed and made the argument for a single lid tectonic episode in Earth history, the Mesoproterozoic, which corresponds to the boring billion of the video we watched at the beginning. And in 2023, an exploration of an earlier episode of plate tectonics in the Paleoproterozoic during a time that's known as the Urey, 1800 to 2050 million years ago. And so I'll go through these very briefly with you. So this is the evolution of plate tectonics paper. It made the argument that the present episode of plate tectonics began in Neoproterozoic time, you know, on the order of 750 million years ago. This is the Mesoproterozoic single lid tectonic episode paper, which if you think about it, if I claim that modern episode of plate tectonics began at 750 million years ago, that immediately implicates, okay, Bob, what is the evidence that there wasn't plate tectonics before 750 million years ago? And for that, you have to look at evidence for something like single lid for the reasons that we've articulated already. And then the last one, it basically addresses sort of the single-minded thinking that I was doing 20 years ago when I started on this journey. It's like, okay, the plate tectonics is like a light switch. It's on or off. And we turned it on once. And everything before that, we don't know, we don't care. But in fact, as over the years that I've been working on this and dealing with criticisms, it became increasingly clear that there was evidence for an earlier episode of plate tectonics that couldn't be neglected. And in fact, that's what this paper addresses, is this earlier episode of plate tectonics in the Urey. All right, so the bottom line is that plate tectonics started twice in the last 2.5 billion years. So here is the last 2.5 billion years. So the Archean's not shown here, the Hadean's not shown here. This is just the Paleoproterozoic, the Mesoproterozoic, the Neoproterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. So we know we're in plate tectonics today. And the argument that it began around 750 million years ago is there. And then here's the time when there was a single lid episode. And you notice these transitions. The thing that is increasingly clear is that it isn't like a light switch. It's like a slow transformation. There are these transitions that take unknown time periods, but probably hundreds of millions of years. And then prior to this is the boring billion of the video, right? This single lid episode. Prior to that, we've got the Paleoproterozoic plate tectonic episode. And then there was probably an earlier episode of single lid tectonics before that. That's the story that I now think is correct. And you can see the beautiful job that Clint did making this graphic. All right, so what's the basis of this conclusion? It's one thing to claim something, it's something else to convince skeptics, and all good scientists are skeptics of that statement. And so the answer is PTIs and SLIs. It's like, oh, good, more acronyms. Okay, so what are they? PTIs are plate tectonic indicators. These are rocks and minerals made by plate tectonic processes. For example, ophiolites, blue schists, ultra-high pressure metamorphic rocks. So sometimes people will talk about trace element abundances and isotopes. I don't consider them to be plate tectonic indicators. I'm not going to talk a lot more about them, but when you see somebody claiming that they've got good evidence for when plate tectonics started based on some isotopes or trace elements, I would be very, very skeptical. SLIs are single lid indicators, and we are just beginning to explore what these are, because in order to identify them, the way we identify plate tectonic indicators is we study rocks produced by plate tectonics, which is happening today. It's not hard to figure that out. Single lid indicators, that's more difficult because we have to sort of work that out from first principles. So we understand plate tectonic indicators much better than single lid indicators. So let's discuss those first. As I mentioned, there's three primary plate tectonic indicators: ophiolites, blue schists, and ultra-high pressure metamorphic rocks. So ophiolites are fragments of oceanic lithosphere formed by seafloor spreading at mid-ocean ridges, back arc basins, and especially in what becomes the forearc during subduction initiation. We haven't talked about subduction initiation. It's another field that I'm very interested in and have made some contributions to. I didn't mean to do that. Another plate tectonic indicator are blue schists. These are metamorphic rocks that form at high pressures and low temperatures, which are uniquely associated with subduction zones. And you have to subduct down to 40 kilometers or more in order to generate these. Ultra high pressure metamorphic rocks are metamorphic rocks formed by even higher pressure metamorphism, and this is of continental crust subducted to more than 100 kilometers and brought back to the surface. So those are three independent plate tectonic indicators, and over the years I've looked at other things as well. We'll mention that. So here's the ophiolite succession. We talked about layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 being, geophysical ways of investigating the oceanic crust. And here's the interpretation from ophiolites: basaltic pill lavas on top of sheeted dikes, on top of gabbro, and on top of residual peridotites on the order of 5 or 6 or 7 kilometers thick. Now, this is a summary graph from the 2018 paper, and we're looking at seafloor spreading and subduction initiation indicators. That's ophiolites here. This is the ophiolite record from other sources, not mine. Right? I'm to be my compilations would be viewed with skepticism because I could filter out data that I didn't like for reasons that might not. So I use other people's compilations. And this is the blue schist record, right? Here we're looking at, age from the present back 3 billion years ago. Lawsonite, I haven't talked about that, but that's related to blue schist. It's kind of like a blue schist metamorphism. And then jadetite is a subduction-related gemstone. A very different community is interested in jadetite than is interested in ophiolites. So those are subduction indicators. And then the collision indicators are the ultra-high pressure metamorphic rocks, and the collision gemstones, ruby and sapphire. And what you can see is, with a few exceptions for ophiolites, back here, they're all young, Neoproterozoic and younger. The blue schists, Neoproterozoic and younger. Lawsonite metamorphic rocks, pretty much all Phanerozoic. Jadetite, likewise. Ultrahigh pressure metamorphic rocks, Neoproterozoic and younger. Ruby and sapphire, with few exceptions, also. So those are different plate tectonic indicators, and they tell a very similar story. So if modern plate tectonics started about 1 billion years ago, does that explain anything else? And that's, I'm gonna give you 5 examples of other things it explains. These 5 examples aren't an argument for plate tectonics, but they're understood as being consistent with the interpretation of young initiation of modern plate tectonics. So let's take them one by one. So one of them is the evidence for faster cooling after 1 billion years. And this is from this temperature over pressure ratios of metamorphic rocks. So if you think about it, we can determine the peak metamorphic temperatures of metamorphic rocks. And we can also determine their peak metamorphic pressures. These are careful kinds of studies of, thermobarometry, it's called. And this fellow, Michael Brown at Maryland, has done this compilation. And these are all the data in yellow dots. This is the time from the present back to into the Archean. And this is his least squares fit. And I think you can see that the Earth has clearly been started cooling most rapidly, according to this line, and there is a lot of scatter. But it started cooling more rapidly, significantly more rapidly, about 1 billion years ago. Okay. All right. Another is evidence for faster cooling after 1 billion years is the mantle potential temperature from basalts. So we see that the mantle potential temperature isn't changing that much from the Archean, into the Mesoproterozoic, and then it starts to decrease fairly rapidly from about 1500 degrees to about 1350 over the last billion years or so. Now, another argument is the identification of isotopically distinct source regions for hotspot basalts. Remember, mantle plumes are thought to access very deep regions in the lower mantle. We talked about the low velocity zone, the D double prime layer at the base of the mantle. And these 2 pink things on top sort of show where the geophysicists would say the mantle source regions for 2 realms with a lot of hotspot activity. One of them centered on Africa, the African LLVSP, large, low shear velocity provinces at the base of the mantle. And the other one in the Pacific, sort of, Hawaii and Tahiti, and a lot of different hotspot volcanoes based on those. And what you see is that the distribution of these regions corresponds to about where Greater Gondwana land was 500 million years ago. So the argument is that some of this material was subducted and carried down to the base of the mantle, where it heated up. This is called, these rocks are characterized by the Dupont anomaly. So these isotopes we can't go into very well, but suffice it to say that this is an isotopically distinct region that has been interpreted as reflecting the participation of deeply subducted continental crust and associated sediments. All right, the third argument are kimberlites. So kimberlites are basically explosions from the base of the lithosphere. Pressure builds up and it's released in a major eruption. Sometimes it brings up diamonds, and so the economic community is very interested in these. And it's basically fluid pressure that drives kimberlite explosions. No one has ever seen a kimberlite eruption, and I don't think you want to because it would probably break your eardrums. But these things are basically super hydrofracturing from the base of the lithosphere. Now, if we look at the age of kimberlites, they are overwhelmingly Phanerozoic. So here is the Archean. These are Archean kimberlites, Paleoproterozoic, Mesoproterozoic, Neoproterozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. So you can see that there's a tremendous increase in the abundance of kimberlites, in the Phanerozoic time. And can that be explained in terms of what we understand about subduction history? Yes. So this is what we might see, say, more than a billion years ago, where there was no subduction. There's the diamonds. Diamonds are very old. Kimberlites are very young. So there's really no buildup of fluid pressure at the base of the lithosphere that can bust through and carry diamonds to the surface. But once we start subduction, lots of fluids are being released continuously, and some of these are likely to be trapped at the base of the continental lithosphere, and under certain conditions could break through, could explode through, could carry diamonds to the surface, and erupt in a kimberlite. So this interpretation of a relatively young onset of plate tectonics and deep subduction is consistent with the kimberlite record. Now, another thing that is quite interesting is the Neoproterozoic snowball Earth. So this was a time when Earth's climate changed drastically, and some people think that the entire planet froze over. Other people say, no, it was just glaciation to an unusual extent. It doesn't matter. There were two major episodes. One of them is called the Sturgeon, which happened, between about 717 to 660 million years ago. And the other one is the Marinoan, which would happen younger. So these two major episodes are different times when the snowball Earth scenario is thought to have happened. So here we see Earth's glacial record. So we're up here, we're not really in a snowball. It's thought that there might have been a snowball back at 2500 or so. But these are the Neoproterozoic snowball Earths, and all sorts of things happen. This is the seawater carbon isotope record, and it goes record. It's telling you something is really happening strange with life, and we're not going to get into that. That would be a course in its own right. And then there's the kimberlite record, there's the ophiolite record, Lucius, ultra high pressure metamorphic rocks, and here is the Neoproterozoic snowball Earth record. Could it have been caused by the transition of plate tectonics? So these are the various explanations for Neoproterozoic snowball Earth. There are 4 groups of explanations. Extraterrestrial, something happened out in space that affected Earth climate. 11 geodynamic ones. 3 oceanographic ones, like oceanic stagnation, enhanced organic burial, and 3 biotic ones. Now, obviously, the extraterrestrial ones can't be explained as being the result of plate tectonics start, but all of these others are potentially relatable to a start of plate tectonics around this time. And I'm not saying all of these happened. I'm not saying none of these happened, but of the geodynamic ones, the oceanographic and the biotic, those are consistent with what might have happened as a result of the start to plate tectonics. So that's another explanation, not explanation, another consistency from talking about plate tectonics starting in the Neoproterozoic. And then finally, one of the most interesting aspects is biological evolution really sped up in the Neoproterozoic. So here we've got all of the, when the different genera diversified. These are all of the present genera that we have. Let's see, which ones are we? Oh yeah, we're vertebrates. But, these are different, seashells and stuff, different phyla, different genera. The diversification started about 800 million years ago and accelerated as we went through the Neoproterozoic. And by the end of the Neoproterozoic, all of the major genera were established, not their present manifestations, but all of the, you could call them the body plans for the major genera. So how could the change in tectonic style do that? So if we think about how tectonic styles influence life evolution, single lid, it's not going to provide very many trace elements like phosphorus and iron and things, especially animals need to thrive. The oxygenation would have been weak. The climate control would have been weak. It would be prone to overheat because it wouldn't be a good way to recycle atmospheric CO2. The habitat formation, you wouldn't be creating very many habitats that were changing very often. So the environmental pressure would have been either weak or they could have been catastrophic when there was a major large igneous province, mantle plume event. In contrast, plate tectonics, because you build mountains, the bioactive element supply would be high, the oxygenation, because of greater burial of organic carbon, would have been stronger. The climate control would have been stronger because of the many feedbacks. The habitat formation with the opening and closing of ocean basins and collisions would have been stronger. So the environmental pressure would have been mostly moderate and rarely catastrophic. So this transformation would have strongly influenced the evolution of life as well. So if the modern episode of plate tectonics began in the Neoproterozoic, what was Earth's tectonic style before this? It had to be some kind of a Mesoproterozoic single lid tectonics. And what's the evidence for this? Well, single lid indicators. So it's time for a visit to the boring billion. So this is the Mesoproterozoic is kind of, the heart of the boring billion. So we have to talk about plate tectonic indicators and single lid indicators during this interval. So the term boring billion, it talks about, is thought that it came from basically the fact that the biologists didn't see much change in the biota, so they started calling it the boring billion. And these are some quotes from the literature. I won't go over them. We're not running out of time, but we're definitely seeing the 20 minutes till it's over. So here are the plate tectonic indicators, and what you see immediately is there are actually some ophiolites in here, but not very many. There's no blue schist, there's no lawsonite, there's no jadotite, there's no ultra high pressure metamorph. There are none. Oh, there's one ruby, so maybe one. This is a time when the plate tectonic indicators, so common in the Neoproterozoic and younger, are completely missing. Now you could say, oh, that's just erosion that removed that. Okay. So if we accept that the absence of plate tectonic indicators doesn't necessarily mean that plate tectonics wasn't going on, some people use the statement, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. especially for things far back in the historical record. So it could be that. But let's as I said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We know that the record of Earth history is increasingly destroyed with time. Maybe all of the Mesoproterozoic plate tectonic indicators have been removed by erosion and tectonics. So let's see if we can define what a single-lid indicator would be, and then we can also see if there's pre-Mesoproterozoic PTIs that are preserved, right? If there are older plate tectonic indicators, then that weakens the argument that the Mesoproterozoic plate tectonic indicators were all removed by erosion, right? Okay, so what might be good single-lid indicators? So number one, we don't have subduction zones, so that means we're not pumping water into the mantle. So we would have drier magmas, and petrologists recognize anorthosites and a kind of granitic rock called A-type granite as representing melts that were formed in drier tectonic regimes. One might also expect that with this, single lithospheric blanket, that the Earth might actually heat up. But it would certainly cool down less rapidly than under plate tectonics for the reasons we've explored. And then the other thing that you would expect would be there wouldn't be any new passive margins formed. We know that passive margins form as continents rift and break apart, and then the margins subside as they cool, and sediments pour in from the continent and cover the rifted crust. So we would expect that there wouldn't be any passive margins formed during this time, right? Here we're looking at sort of an artist, not very good artist representation. That's me. Early to mid Proterozoic, early to mid Mesoproterozoic, 1.6 to 1.2, with A-type granites and anorthosites, with blocks foundering from the base of the lithosphere. Here we've got, an interpretation of what's happening in the late Mesoproterozoic when we get the Grenville type of orogenies, like we get down by Austin. And then this is the modern plate tectonic regime. All right, so these are the single-lid indicators. Dry magma indicator 1, which are A-type granites. Dry magma indicator 2, which are anorthosites. The insolation indicator, which is the thermobarometric ratio, T over P for metamorphic rocks. And then the distribution of passive margins through time. So A-type granites, they're still being produced, but they were especially common in the Mesoproterozoic. Anorthosites, they're no longer being produced. These are the area of particular outcrops, and you can see that there's a real concentration of anorthositic rocks in the Mesoproterozoic. The thermobarometric ratio sort of is high during the Mesoproterozoic, and has decreased significantly since then. And the passive margin starting times, this is shown with less confidence and more confidence from another scientist's compilation. And we can see, right now we're generating lots of passive margins and have been for quite some time. And the lack of that in the Mesoproterozoic. So, thinking about these single-lid indicators suggests that what we're seeing with the absence of plate tectonic indicators is approximately correct, that the evidence, this is a very different time from a tectonic point of view. Now, there's another community that's interested in Earth's tectonic evolution, and that's the ore deposit community. So minerals and metals are becoming increasingly important these days. That's why I will be teaching a course in the fall on minerals and metals for sustainability. I think students need to have an opportunity to learn about the broad spectrum of ore deposits that are out there. And so what we can see here on the right are two plots. The upper one is showing what I'm calling Mesoproterozoic single lid magmatic ore deposits. So certain types of ore deposits that we can't go into now. One of them is called Kiruna magnetite apatite deposits. One of them is called iron oxide copper gold, or IOCG. And one of them is called ilmenite and orthosite. And what we see is this concentration of these kinds of deposits in the Mesoproterozoic and their absence from younger and older times. Now, in contrast, let's look at some plate tectonic related mineralizations. And the two big ones are orogenic gold and porphyry copper deposits. And we can see there's quite a few of them being produced, in the Phanerozoic. And interestingly enough, quite a few of them in the Archean, but none in the Mesoproterozoic. So these orogenic gold and porphyry coppers are thought to be fluid-rich mineralization systems, and they're missing. So this economic community got a completely different perspective on these things, and there's evidence from their work that the Mesoproterozoic was quite different, consistent with the single lid tectonic hypothesis. All right, now, once we say, okay, the Mesoproterozoic was a single lid episode, it basically says, okay, what happened before that? And that brings us back into the Paleoproterozoic. And there we see evidence for an earlier episode of plate tectonics. Let's look at that. So this is the most recent paper, 2023. And it was basically my recognition of this strong evidence for earlier plate tectonics. But it wasn't a very long period. It was only 250 million years. So this is a plot of zircon ages that have been compiled. You can see these are just thousands and thousands of them. But these zircons form in igneous rocks, granites in particular, but they're incredibly robust. They're very hard to destroy. And so in a very useful sense, the abundance of zircons of a certain age gives us a nice idea of the relative abundance of crust that was continental crust that was formed at that age. And what we can see is, certainly there's going to be a lot of zircons today because of a bunch of reasons. There was relatively small amount of zircons produced in the Mesoproterozoic in here. And the second biggest peak after today is in this Paleoproterozoic time that we're interested in. So this is a very important time of crust formation. Now, this map shows the examples of ophiolites of Orosirian age. That's 1.8 to 2.05. And the ophiolites of this age, these are actually 1.85 to 2.15 in blue. India, Scandinavia, West Africa, Canada. There's 7 different examples of ophiolites of this age around the world. They're not just in one place. Now, eclogites, we also mentioned them. They are, many of them also form in subduction zones, and there are 6 examples of eclogites of that age around the world. So those are quite interesting evidence for something like plate tectonics during this time, before the Mesoproterozoic. So if we look at this compilation of T over P, right, from metamorphic rocks, by Brown and Johnson. So these are, these blue dots are metamorphosed in relatively cold environments with high pressures and low temperatures. That would be subduction zones. So these are our blue schists. They're quite abundant in the Neoproterozoic and younger, and there's one in the late Mesoproterozoic, and then there's 4 of them in the Paleoproterozoic. And in contrast, there's lots and lots of these high temperature, low pressure metamorphic rocks. So this metamorphic episode associated with the Orosirian includes a significant proportion of low temperature, high pressure metamorphic rocks, consistent with something like plate tectonics. And it also witnessed an important episode of passive margin formation. These are 2 different compilations. This one is by Bradley. He's just measuring the number of them with start dates of a certain time. And this one by Condi is measuring their average length, of the passive margins through time. So he's distinguishing between modern ones that still exist, and in black, the ones that no longer exist but are caught up in orogenic belts. And you can see that the second peak, after the Phanerozoic, is here in this Orosirian time. So that it is an important argument for something like plate tectonics happening at this time. So the bottom line is that plate tectonics started twice in the last 2.5 billion years. This earlier episode lasted, but ended, and then we went into a very long period of single lid tectonics, and then only in the last several 100 million years did we come into the plate tectonic realm. Now, what does that do for our Urey ratio? So here we were showing the same thing we showed before, but we've got some additional stuff. So we've got our geologic our time going back. We've got our different temperatures for basaltic rocks and therefore the mantle. We've got our Urey ratio 0.3 going up to the molten earth. And this red line has been added to show how I think cooling would have happened with this kind of a complicated tectonic history, with a single lid episode 1, an early plate tectonic episode 1, then a second single lid episode 2, and the present plate tectonic episode 2. So during single lid episodes, the Earth doesn't cool off much, but as soon as we go into plate tectonics, it starts cooling off quite a bit. And then as we go into single lid Mesoproterozoic, it doesn't cool off much, but as soon as we go into plate tectonics, it starts cooling off fast. And that is not a bad way to explain Earth's thermal history as captured by these studies of basaltic rocks through time. That there have been episodes of low Urey ratio corresponding to plate tectonic episodes, and there have been episodes of high Urey ratio corresponding to single lid tectonic episodes. So we've got some short videos on some of these topics on our YouTube channel. So one of them is about the coevolution of life in plate tectonics that I presented at AGU. A video about biogeodynamics, how Earth's tectonic evolution is reflected in its biosphere. The plate tectonic pump, where the pumping has got to do with driving evolution. Emergence, a chaotic system pushed into organization. That's got to do with the the transition from single lid to plate tectonics. Formation of a new subduction zone by lithospheric collapse next to a fracture zone. That's might be pertinent because that's the way we had to do the start plate tectonics or something like that. And then finally, There's a video on subduction initiation in nature and models.